And this is one where Peterson is telling Joe Rogan about climate change and why he doesn't think it's possible to have science about climate change.
One is a weird one. So that
well,
one,
that's because there's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word. And that's what bothers me about the climate change types. It's like, this is something that bothers me about it technically. It's like, well, climate is about everything. So, okay, but your models aren't based on everything. Your models are based on a set number of variables.
Yeah.
So that means you've reduced the variables, which are everything, to that set. Well, how did you decide which set of variables to include in the equation if it's about everything? And that's not just a criticism. That's like, if it's about everything, your models aren't right. Because your models do not and cannot model everything.
What do you mean by everything when you say?
Well, that's what people who talk about the climate apocalypse claim in some sense. We have to change everything. It's like, everything, eh? Okay, what? And the same with the word environment. That word doesn't mean, it means much that it actually doesn't mean anything. Like when you say everything, in a sense, that's meaningless, right? Because, well, what are you pointing to? Well, I'm pointing to everything. Well, what's the difference between the environment and everything? There's no difference. What's the difference between climate and everything? Well, there's no difference. So this is a crisis of everything? It's like, no, it's not. Or if it is, well, if it really is, then we're done because we can't fix everything.
This, by the way, from the man who once said that ideas make the world, or indeed, ideas are the world in a more than metaphysical sense, right? Now hectoring us about how precisely we try to define the term environment. So,
yeah, I love the shit eating grin at the end of that. It's like, well, I mean, if it is everything, then, we're done. Like it just, it is he has a really interesting sense of how science works. I mean, there's also a different part that there wasn't in that clip where he says that you can't have models to predict climate change because models have to be about information that is from the past, and so you can't have models that predict the future based on what happened in the past.
I think that's just Hume's inductive reasoning argument. I mean, I'm not an expert in empirical philosophy, but I'm not sure if that invalidates all scientific prediction.
No, this is what irritates me about it, because, again, he seems so close to discovering basic truths of the philosophy of science, and then he constantly backs away from them if that leads to bad political outcomes for him, right? Because, of course, you could claim that anything is about everything, right? Politics could be about everything, because if you extend outwards from human beings, you have to talk about biology, talk about physics, talk about all that, right? But, we can appreciate that when we're trying to engage in empirical research, that we have to narrow our field of vision and make testable hypotheses that exclude a huge number of variables. But what he doesn't account for is the fact that it's no single person who's doing this. It's not like there's one environmental scientist out there saying, I'm going to go out and single-handedly make hypotheses after hypotheses about every facet of the environment over the globe. You have literally thousands of climate scientists doing this over many decades, accumulating data and sharing it. And that's how I reach something approximating a scientific consensus. And there might be flaws with this method, right? But it's generally worked pretty well when it comes to predicting things like, I don't know, our basketball is going to drop from the CN Tower if you let them go, because gravity will operate upon them. And it's baffling to me that he doesn't appreciate these very basic truths about the scientific method, or truisms, I should say, that most of us learned in grade 10 chemistry or something.
Well, it's also kind of funny, like when he talks about, like the limitations of these kinds of variables. It's like, because like you'd almost forget, when he's saying that this is like a guy who's attempting to explain like, all human personality, based on like a biologization of a set of like Jungian archetypes, something like that, right? So it's amazing. It's really interesting what meets the bar for what science is and what doesn't, right?
I think
Yeah.
oh,
Sorry,
Dan.
Barry, please.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking of one of the criticisms that, like, all of us, I think, raised in our essays for the book, which was that despite of giving himself this rule in the 12 Rules for Life, that you have to be, accurate in your, like, be precise in your discourse and when you are, like, making arguments, and like, how many times he fails to do so, because in the clip that you just showed, he seems to be first criticizing, like, the scientists for, like, their methodological kind of concerns about trying to talk about everything, and then he's also criticizing, like, the critiques they are making about, I don't know, like, about how everything is also wrong with the world. Like, it seems to me that he's making two sets of claims there that he's just conflating, which is, like, one about the method and one about, like, the set of claims they are making. I don't know, like, I always find it difficult with Peterson to break down, like, some of the things he's saying, precisely because he fails to be so accurate about things that he talks. And, like, as Matt was saying, like, things we, like, sometimes learn, like, so long time ago about this is how science operates, etc.
Yeah, and I want to point out, like, my philosophy of science isn't particularly advanced, but I kind of broadly endorse a kind of neo-Popperian view with a little bit of Lakatos thrown in, right? And I do think that there is something, again, to the idea that science is a communal enterprise, which is one of the reasons that I have a lot of respect for climate scientists, right? If you were to talk to any one of them, they would tell you that they just have a fraction of the story because they can only test a limited range of variables in a very circumscribed situation. And that's how they can accumulate relatively plausible knowledge about it, or unfalsifiable knowledge, if you'd rather use a more technical term, right? Non-falsified knowledge. And gradually speaking, over time and over the course of, I think what it is now, we started studying this in the early 20th century, right? We've accumulated a massive data about how it is that industrial trends have shifted the climate in very bad directions. And this has been unfalsified for a huge period of time at this point, to the point where I think there are more scientists who now agree with the idea that man-made climate change is real than agree with the idea that the theory of evolution, as posited by Darwin, is a plausible hypothesis for how human life emerged. Right? That's a pretty good number of people.
Well, I don't think it's so different necessarily. There is perhaps a consistency in a sense with his sort of postulate of the significance of or the defining status of ideas for society, because I think that I'm reminded here of there's a passage by Louis Althusser, an appendix to on contradiction and overdetermination. And in it, what he basically points out is that any kind of scientific thesis, if we want to critique it through the prism of philosophy, will be proven inadequate at some point, right? Precisely because the nature of philosophy is that we start with questions like, how does one access reality, right? This sort of inductive argument we were talking about that's kind of reprised from Hume. But ultimately science has a provisional quality to it, right? There's certain presuppositions which are made, which are a condition to the kinds of provisional information it's capable of generating, right? But again, if you want to take that sort of philosophic angle, I think it is you can discredit any argument that way, right? That's scientific.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I mean, and I'd also point out, like, Jordan Peterson is a big fan of free market economics on the basis of the good results that he says have come about in the past, right? He'll make this sort of very simple, sort of Steven Pinkerish argument that capitalism for the last, however many hundreds of years has, raised the floor of people's living standards, such and such amount. And there's always this implication, at least hovering over it, that this will continue to happen in the future. And of course, economics, I mean, that's like all of the, all of the decisions that people make, right? The buying and selling decisions, at least. There is at least an interesting double standard here. Marion mentioned one of his rules was relevant to this. And I do want to go back to the rules in a minute, because there are, since we wrote the book, there are 12 new ones. It's we're up to 24 rules for life, not just 12. It's a lot harder.
One for every hour of the day.
That's right. Yeah. But first, I do want to say to be fair, that in that clip that we just played, he doesn't stop at just saying that, well, I don't know what environment means or climate means, so what are we even talking about here, right? Like, he does sort of acknowledge that environmental problems or climate problems could exist. But I think his solution is really interesting. Jake, do we have the second part of this clip?
The fastest way to make the planet sustainably green and ecologically viable is to make poor people as rich as possible, as fast as we possibly can. Because the thing about poor people is that, well, first of all, they're not resource efficient. They use a lot of resources to produce very, very little outcome. And so that's a problem. Slash and burn agriculture, for example. But even more importantly, when you're insecure on a day-to-day basis, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you're not paying attention to the broader environment, that hated word, around you. Mm-hmm. And you can't even really worry about your children's future in some real sense, because no, you don't understand. Lunch is the future. We don't have lunch, we're hungry, and that goes on for like a month, we're dead. That's the future. So what happens, if you can get resources to the poorest section of the population, as soon as they get to the point where they have some hope of a genuine future, especially for their children, they immediately become concerned about broader environmental considerations. And then the attempt to make the environment habitable and sustainable, that comes up of its own accord at a grassroots level and spreads everywhere.
Oh. This annoys me so much because he's repeating the trope that there's a poorest that gonna pollute the more and are responsible for the most CO2 and gas emissions, which again the data shows that that's not true. On average, it's people on the have better incomes or have higher incomes, the ones that we have the most energy kind of consuming lifestyles, people have houses in the in developed countries that have AC, heating, pools, there's data that actually shows how it's this part of the population that are the ones actually responsible for that. So although I kind of appreciate his concern now with raising people out of poverty, repeating this trope, because these are the ones that don't aren't concerned with the environment. And it also annoys me on the level of all the environmentalists, indigenous environmentalists that precisely their defense of the land and their lifestyle is precisely out of a concern because of the environment, especially in the third world and in Latin America, and particularly from Mexico, the country I come from. That's they come not only from a defense of dispossession of land, environmentalists also are defending precisely the environment and the repercussions that it will have. And these are poor people, usually they've been impoverished, right, by the state, by capitalism. So I don't know, I'm just this failure he has, as you were saying, of kind of just pick, he kind of picks data and certain science, right? Oh, this helps my argument, so I will include it here.
Well, there's another issue going on there, which is that I think the kernel of truth in his argument is that if you look at a lot of countries which are poorer than the United States, for example, you see that they have higher emissions per person on the surface level, right? But that occurs within a particular context. Right. So a lot of countries, in Africa, which are not industrial powerhouses, for example, their emissions per person are way below a 200th of the average American. But what you'll find is that, in China, for example, it's higher than the US. But then you ask yourself, well, why is that? Right. And it's because China is the manufacturing hub in the world. And actually, it's because they're producing things for American consumers. Right. So if you actually trace the goods, not on the basis of where they're produced, right, but who they're being produced for, where the demand actually exists, then you realize that the problem, has almost entirely to do, right, with the copious levels of consumption which exist in the West, right? So I just find it to be quite a confused sort of analysis in general,
Yeah, and I want to put it a somewhat different way. because one of the kind of main lines of criticism that he engages in when he directs these kinds of attacks towards the left, I do actually have a little bit of sympathy towards, because he'll frequently attack the kind of primitivist version of the left, which says that we need to rein back development for the sake of preserving the environment. Interestingly enough, I think this also echoes the criticisms that Marx made of the Luddites, for instance, in the 19th century, right? That the way to smash capitalism was actually to smash the machines of capitalism rather than change social relations, right? And the reason I think this is a bad argument is that the world actually produces an excess of food every year.
Right.
The main leftist critique that I have sympathy with would say, look, we already have everything that we need to give people the good quality of life that he's talking about. And we're not doing it not because the resources are unavailable, because of those social relations. So for instance, the United States alone, about 30% of the food produced is thrown out every year rather than redistributed, including to the United States as poor, right? And you can see comparable numbers around the globe because since the Green Revolution, we produce an excess of food every year. And despite that, we still have 1 billion people in poverty. Nathan Robinson wrote a really good article about this, right? Where he said, the primitivist argument doesn't work because we want the technology available to give people a high quality of life. But what's never really acknowledged by people like Pinker or Peterson is that these technologies and the resources have existed for a long time now. So it's the social system that's the problem that needs to be changed if we're going to provide people with the kind of life that they deserve and the kind of environment that they deserve, for that matter.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think this is the biggest problem with it. I mean, it's certainly true, as Mary points out, that the consumption, that much more environmental destruction, of course, is caused by things that are done to service consumption needs of people who have more income, obviously, but also that I think it is really significant that all he could imagine, right, as a solution to this is that you'll just change the motivations of individual people. And then, I don't know, they'll come up with something, right? That you're going to have that once the psychology of individual people change, that they'll care more about the quality of the environment, that'll somehow or another, get it done by itself. And again, I mean, I agree with Conrad. I mean, it's not like there's nothing to the idea that that you have to that people in some circumstances, who don't have their basic material needs met, will be more resistant to certainly anything that smacks of sacrifice, for long-termist reasons. But again, he just the idea that something could be a product of bad systems or bad institutions is something that he just seems to be completely resistant to. I mean, from hearing that, you would get the impression that the practices that caused the most environmental damage, were arrived at from democratic procedures in which the poorest people in the world got to decide what had happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is where I actually think something like Marxism can be extremely helpful as a kind of analytical lens, because again, one of the criticisms made by the Luddite movement, which is in some senses the first kind of leftist primitivist movement, was that the basis for immiseration of the working classes was the machines that were created, right? That machines threw people out of work. This kind of bourgeois argument that there was a one-to-one or an aggregate relation between jobs created and jobs lost was wrong. And so what we do is we go in and smash the machines. And somewhere Marx wrote that over the course of the 19th century, one profound development was the proletariat coming to realize that machines weren't the enemy, right? It was the social relations that were the problem. And I think something very true something very similar is true today, which is that we have to realize that the technologies which enable us to produce food, with the exception of the meat industry, I think, are generally good things. And the world produces enough food for everyone to have a 2,600 caloric intake a day, I think is what I saw, which is above average, by the way. The problem is the social relations, global social relations, I should say, surrounding food and other forms of development. And that's what we need to change by confronting capital, especially neoliberal capital.
Well, I think though with Marxism, we should add, I don't disagree with you. I think that the vision of Marxism is very, very powerful in terms of how it situates the problem at the level of social relations, which Peterson consistently, fails to do when he establishes these sort of binaries, right? I think in this clip, he starts out and he says like, the left claims they want to help the poor, but, invariably this is going to have some sort of environmentally deleterious effect. You know, I mean, the question here is never really set up in terms of redistribution of wealth, or, you know, the effects of an economy that's predicated on consumption, or these kind of things. But I also think that, you know, in a way, you know, I agree with you about, I think, the positivity of Marx's vision. I just want to say that there are certain issues there, right? You know, I think, you know, Marx took it as quite definitive at a certain point, you know, in his career that, you know, Liebig's sort of discovery of soil science, you know, completely disproved the Malthusian hypothesis, right? According to which there were these sort of finite limits, right, to production. And, you know, later on in Marx's work, you know, there are signs that he started to, you know, move away from that hypothesis and to think that, well, maybe actually, you know, like maybe we shouldn't take it as an article of faith, right? The production can always be augmented, right? You know, in a context where it isn't going to have, you know, permanent damaging effects. So it's, you know, it's a little bit inchoate, but I think, you know, this whole idea of metabolic rift, right, with like John Bellamy Foster, you know, part of the focus is to try to, you know, demonstrate that Marxism needn't be a sort of thoughtless productivism in that way, right? So, you know, I think one can talk about social relations, but we also have to have, you know, a model for, you know, what nature is, right? You know, to use these vagaries Peterson protests so much, you know, against what climate is, you know, and what the foreseeable limitations of production will be within that context, and given the social, you know, nexus available to us.
Yeah, fair enough. I would also say, I think to Matt's point that I think that there's a assumption that is bad, that, you know, that does maybe go into part of what, you know, Peterson's criticizing in some of the less thought out left takes on climate change, that, you know, just sort of producing less per se, right, is the way out, right? And I think, you know, I just point people to like what my friend Lee Phillips has written about this stuff. You know, that I think you need to, in some ways, like step up certain kinds of technological development to deal, you know, to deal appropriately with climate change. But regardless, I think we can agree that just changing individual behavior, or changing the psychology of individual behavior, is not going to get it done. Okay,
No, I would say though, I think that Zizek made a really good point on that, which is generally the kind of position I take on these, which is that the temptation the left needs to avoid is precisely adopting these kind of Petersonian dispositions, which hold climate change to be some kind of punishment for immoral individual behavior, right? And so the way to solve it is at the individual level by, you know, religiously recycling, right, and making sure that all the cans go in the right bag. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, and neither is he, right? But fixating on that and the kind of moralistic rhetoric that we often see associated with it divorces our attention away from the kinds of social relations and technological relations to nature, to appeal to Hamilton's point, that we need to be attentive to, because they're at the basis of the problem, right? So I'm very wary of any kind of moralistic approach to resolving climate change, even if I do think that people should recycle, right? As Marion will tell you, something that I can sometimes be less than perfect on myself. So I'll chastise myself later on for that, but, you know. Yeah.
I have a, you know, get a Big Mac in the old fashioned non-biodegradable containers and throw it out the window because I'm an American.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.